All right. I would like to introduce our last speaker for the day. We are incredibly lucky to have with us Shaun Gallagher, who's a very well-known philosopher of embodied cognition. Super exciting. Dr. Gallagher is the Lillian and Morrie Moss Chair of Excellence in Philosophy at the University of Memphis in Memphis, Tennessee. And he is also Professorial Fellow at the University of Wollongong in Australia. We are looking forward to your talk today. His talk is entitled Writing Empathy into the Script from Jane Austen to J.L. Austen. All right. Thank you. Turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in lieu of an outline, here is something like a program. I trust you can hear me at this point. So I'll start by talking about aesthetic narratives, and then talk about different ideas concerning empathy, and go on to say more about a difference between scripted and unscripted types of situations. And I list here the cast. I'll be talking about some of these people: Jane Austen, Richard Gere, Marion Inglis, J.L. Austen, Gilbert Ryle, Merleau-Ponty, and then I have cameos by Theodore Leaps, David Freeberg, and Victoria. So I want to start by mentioning that I had the opportunity last summer to attend a week-long workshop in a place called Meteora in Kastraki in Greece. This was organized by Lambros Malaforos as part of his European project. And what he did was he gathered together a number of academics from different disciplines. I was the token philosopher. And we came together with a group, a large group of potters who were working in ceramic arts. And the idea was to explore the experience and the meaning of the types of artistic performances that are involved in pottery. It was in a very beautiful location. Meteora is a place that has these cliff-like rock structures just sticking up out of the ground, and on top of some of them are monasteries that are built there, which are quite amazing to visit. Well, when the artists presented their work, in just about every case, in contrast to most academic presentations, they presented a narrative. And typically the narrative they presented was about their everyday life, some event, a party, a death, a funeral, that basically gave them the idea for the particular piece that they wanted to create. And they created pieces specifically for the workshop in Meteora. So it was, some encounter with someone who said something, or observing something that their child was doing, some visit to a friend or relative that generated a theme for them and sparked the idea. And this was their way of introducing us to the art. In many cases, by means of this narrative, I think we gained an immediate empathic sense for both the artist and the artwork. So, for example, in this particular piece, the story, the narrative was about the artist who was struggling with some personal depression, feeling burdened and worried, but then visiting a farm where people were taking care of mistreated donkeys. And so what came out of that visit was something that changed her, and there was some kind of empathy with the animals involved, but also an attempt to express something like her struggle, what she had to bear, and what the donkeys had to bear as well. So so I'm thinking, looking at this image, we might have this kind of resonance in some sense. And I was just mentioning Friedberg and Galese's 2007 paper, where they argue that we can feel a sense of exertion as it registers in the mirror system, as, for example, when we view Michelangelo's slave called Atlas. So we might think about this kind of an immediate resonance as a kind of basic empathy. Others have argued for a kind of higher order simulation process of putting ourselves in the shoes of others, using a form of imagination, for example. Alvin Goldman is one of these philosophers who argue in this way. And on this view, one has to build on one's own experience to be able to create the simulation, which introduces what I've termed something like a diversity problem. It's not always clear how, based just on one's own experience, one might be able to empathize with diverse or different people or different situations. Atlas, in this case, is not actually wearing shoes, so I can't really put myself in his shoes. And certainly, it's a case that this is an ancient, a piece of art that goes back quite to, I guess, the Renaissance in this case. An alternative hermeneutical approach emphasizes the role of narrative in the experience of empathy. And narratives may include one's own narrative, one's own story, but also it may include the stories that others tell, not only about me, but about themselves. So we can even go further and say narratives include shared cultural narratives that are found in stories, in histories, novels, films, and so forth. I think then there's a diversity of narratives that we can access, and those diverse narratives in some way might be able to address the diversity problem. At least those narratives, and the more that we have of them, give us more diverse insights into different ways of living, different characters, and so forth and so on. So narrative goes beyond the immediacy of basic empathy, and I think it can enrich experience and perhaps even change that kind of basic empathy, enhancing it perhaps. In this case, for example, you might just see this artwork without knowing the story behind it, and that might cause some kind of resonance in you. But if you know the narrative and you know about the depression and the mistreated donkeys and so forth, maybe that gives you something more in terms of generating a sense of a feeling of narrative, of empathy. And something more here is that as I mentioned, these artworks were designed specifically for the meeting in Meteora, and a lot of the artworks kind of took on the shape of the cliffs. So I don't know if you can see that, but just the very shape of this art has a significance that goes beyond what you actually see. So it's tied to a kind of place and time. Scripted narratives. So I wrote a paper with my daughter, who is an actor, and what we asked was, what does it mean to say that an actor can empathize with her character? If she's playing a character, portraying a character, does she in fact empathize with that character? And is that part of an aesthetic experience that is had by the performer? And we argued that an important part of such empathy, which may be positive or negative, depends not on a narrow in-the-head simulation process or on a theoretical theory of mind type of inference about what is going on in the character's mind, but rather on an understanding of the character's narrative. And in fact, actors study their characters and try to understand their story. But I think evidence for this comes from three sources: an actor, Richard Gere; a philosopher, Gilbert Ryle; and a novelist, Jane Austen. So Richard Gere, again, I had this opportunity to meet Richard Gere and talked to him about some of this. We actually started talking about theater. This was a couple of years after the movie Chicago came out, where he did a song and dance performance in that movie. And I started to ask him about that. We started talking about theater, about the phenomenon of blocking, which is about how stages are arranged and so forth. But what he said was that the important thing for film was that they had a good script. A well-written script made the acting a lot easier, made remembering the lines a lot easier, made the whole thing a lot easier. So he wanted to emphasize that and that was something he thought was a little bit different from theater. Although I would think also that a good script in theater would also be good. Another piece of evidence, I think, comes from Gilbert Ryle and what he says about Jane Austen. So here's a quote from Ryle, his 1949 concept of mind. When Jane Austen wishes to show the specific kind of pride which characterized the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, she had to represent her actions, words, thoughts, and feelings in 1,000 different situations. There's no one standard type of action or reaction such that Jane Austen could say, my heroine's kind of pride was just the tendency to do this whenever a situation of that sort arose. That would not be enough. Ryle says she really has to, put it into all different kinds of situations, put the character into all kinds of different situations, show what her actions are, her words, her thoughts, feelings, and this would give us then a sense of who that character is. Now, I think this is, in a certain sense, writing empathy into the script, where we're portraying actions, words, thoughts, feelings in a narrative structure, which gives us that kind of narrative access to the other person, or in this case, the character. There's 2 points that I want to make. If our empathic understanding of the character on the page or on the stage or in the film depends on the script or the narrative, we should think that this is also the case in unscripted everyday life, which is based, I think, not on anything like explicit narratives that we're reading, but on our capacity for what I refer to as narrative framing, where we frame the other person's actions in terms of some kind of narrative structure. So I tend to see and understand actions as fitting into some narrative. And I think we learn this as we develop, and this becomes part of our ability to understand different situations and what people are doing in those situations. So I think that there's always something like a narrative frame that we appeal to in order to to grasp and to get a sense of what's going on with that other person. I also want to say that, and here's where Jane Austen comes in, that both scripted and unscripted narratives in reflecting our actions and the actions of others also include actions that are speech acts, right? J.L. Austen famously says, by saying something, we do something. So speech is a kind of performative occasion that I will claim intertwines with the kind of narrative that we use to frame the other person's situation. So, of course, we're talking here about unscripted speech acts rather than speech acts that we might find pronounced in the theater or on film. So an important point that puts Austen on the same page as Ryle, and also I'll introduce Merleau-Ponty here. Ryle's discussion of of vowels and unstudied speech in the concept of mind is already, I think, a speech act theory before Austen even, published his speech act theory. Attending to the unstudied speech of others, not just observing their behavior, allows us to gain access to their frame of mind. And that's what he wants to claim. And so he gives an example. He says, in the case of a person who is annoyed with a knotted shoelace, for example, what that person says, together with his way of saying it, discloses or lets us know his frame of mind. Right? Ryle is famous for, criticizing Descartes and the Cartesian conception of an internal space where the mind is, and he wants to deny that there's something like this internal space. The mind is distributed in some fashion in our dispositions to act, dispositions to believe something, and so forth. So we can perceive and we can frame in a kind of narrative sense, and also appeal to what the person actually is saying, to get a sense of what's going on with that person. Unstudied speech acts and avowals are not self-reports. They have a performative function. So if I say I want something, that's not really used to convey information, but to make a request or a demand. Accordingly, unstudied utterances are not reports on inner thoughts. Rather, it's similar to what Merleau-Ponty says of speech, that speech accomplishes thought. It's not that we think first in our head and then express it, but it's the expression that actually accomplishes the thinking. So for Merleau-Ponty, the other's speech addresses us as a behavior, not as a hidden mental state. In speech, one responds to the other in an encounter where one repels or accepts the utterance before there is anything like a correlated mental thought, before we start trying to imagine what the thought is. So here is then a quick conclusion. In everyday unscripted social cognition, most of the work is done not only by our embodied engagements, actions, and interactions, which give us a kind of basic empathy, but also by an intertwining of narrative and speech. I have this note because David actually shared his PowerPoint with us, that it seems actually related to the concepts we find in Leaps of narrative empathy and enunciative empathy, or at least David's interpretation of those things. But he can say whether or not that's the case. But the idea of an intertwining of narrative and speech that go into the process of us understanding another person, whether that other person is a character in a novel, and we get some kind of representation of their speech acts, or on stage, or in everyday life. I think something careful should be said here, and Merleau-Ponty, I believe, said it in the context of discussing art in his essay, I and Mind, where he's talking about Cézanne and a number of other artists. And what he says is this: things, and he's talking about perceived nature or perceived objects or others, other people, things, generally speaking, generate an internal equivalent in me. They arouse in me a carnal formula of their presence. So I think we can conceive of that in terms of a Lipsian style resonance, if you want. And he goes on, why shouldn't these correspondences, in turn, give rise to some tracing rendered visible again? And specifically, he's thinking about art as an expression of some of that resonance, some of that empathy that we might feel for whatever. So visible again, in which the eyes of others then could find an underlying motif to sustain their inspection of the world. Thus, he says, there appears a visible to the second power, a carnal essence or icon of the first. He concludes that there is no break at all in this circuit. So the point, and my last point here, is I think bodily actions, speech acts, and narratives are part of the same fabric of active engagement with others, let's say. They are all doing something. Just as first-order speech acts are expressive performances rather than reports about internal mental states, aesthetic narratives, the artist giving an account of her work, or Jane Austen characterizing her character, or the actor portraying her character, these are not reports that present information about the artwork or the character. Rather, they set up an empathic relation between artwork, character, the listener, reader, and audience. Again, I think we can talk about this in terms of the aesthetics of everyday life. That is what happens between interacting agents. Here, John Dewey, I would cite John Dewey's idea that aesthetics is not just for the high order cultural, artistic performances, but in fact is part of everyday life, and there's a continuity between that. So I want to endorse that idea. So thank you very much.